A husband checks his wife's phone for the third time this week. Not because he found anything the first 2 times and he didn't. He checks because the not knowing feels worse than whatever he might find. A wife reads her husband's messages to a female coworker, finds nothing incriminating and still feels her stomach tighten. She reads them again and again. This is not a story about cheating. This is a story about jealousy. And jealousy, even when it never uncovers a single act of betrayal, can still hollow out a marriage from the inside. Here's what makes jealousy so dangerous. It doesn't feel like a flaw. It feels like love. It feels like vigilance. It feels like the natural, even noble response of someone who cares enough to notice. And in small doses, that instinct isn't wrong. But left unexamined, jealousy can quietly become the architecture of a marriage. The lens through which every glance, every late reply, every friendly conversation gets interpreted. And once that lens is in place, almost nothing your partner does can prove your fear wrong, because the fear was never really about evidence in the first place. Today we're going to look at jealousy honestly, not as a moral failing to be ashamed of, but as an ancient, biologically wired emotion that humans have been wrestling with for as long as we've been pairing off into couples. We'll look at where it comes from, why it grips some people so much harder than others, what it actually does to a marriage over time, and then we'll turn to something genuinely useful, a 2,000-year-old philosophical framework that, remarkably, modern psychology keeps circling back to as one of the most effective tools for managing exactly this kind of emotional storm. This isn't about suppressing jealousy or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about understanding it well enough that it stops running the show. Part 1. What jealousy actually is. Let's start by being precise, because people often use jealousy and envy interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Envy is a 2-person emotion. You envy someone because they have something you want, a better job, a nicer house, a more exciting life. Jealousy is a 3-person emotion. It requires a valued relationship and the perceived threat of a rival. Researchers define romantic jealousy as a complex of thoughts, feelings, and actions that follows a perceived threat to a relationship. And importantly, that threat doesn't have to be real. It can be based on a real rival, or it can be based on someone entirely imagined, a projection built out of fear rather than fact. So jealousy in marriage isn't simply "I don't want to lose you." It's closer to "I sense, or I imagine, that something or someone is pulling at the bond between us, and I am reacting to protect that bond." Now here's the part that surprises people. Psychologists who study this emotion generally agree that jealousy itself is not inherently pathological. From an evolutionary standpoint, jealousy appears to be adaptive. Individuals who were completely indifferent to a partner's potential infidelity were, historically, less successful at keeping partners and protecting the family unit than those who paid attention to those signals and acted on them. Researchers describe romantic jealousy as an adaptive emotion tied to evolutionary pressures around mate retention. In other words, a small amount of jealousy may be baked into us by natural selection because historically it worked. This matters because it reframes the conversation. Jealousy is not some shameful glitch in your character. It is closer to a smoke detector, a system designed to alert you to potential threats to something you value. The problem isn't that the smoke detector exists. The problem is what happens when it becomes so sensitive that it goes off every time someone makes toast. Part 2. Why it feels so enormous. If you've ever been blindsided by your own jealousy, surprised by the intensity of your reaction to something fairly small, there's a reason for that, and it has to do with how deeply attachment is wired into the human nervous system. Modern attachment science, building on the work of researchers like Sue Johnson, founder of emotionally focused therapy, describes our need for connection as closer to a biological imperative than a preference. We are wired for connection, the way we are wired for oxygen. Your nervous system in this framework is constantly and largely unconsciously scanning your partner for answers to 2 questions. Are you there for me? And am I enough for you? When jealousy fires, it is rarely just about the specific situation in front of you. It registers less like mild worry and more like the sense that the entire foundation you've built together could give way. This is why a fairly innocent text message can trigger a reaction wildly out of proportion to the actual event. Your conscious mind knows it's just a text. Your nervous system is responding as if the relationship itself is under threat. This is also why jealousy isn't experienced the same way by everyone. For some, it shows up like a flood, panic, hypervigilance, replaying the moment over and over. For others, it's closer to a freeze, emotional shutdown, withdrawal, numbness. Much of that difference traces back to attachment patterns built earlier in life. A large study examining personality and attachment found that higher neuroticism, lower agreeableness, and lower openness all predicted higher romantic jealousy, and that attachment anxiety played a significant role in explaining why personality connects to jealousy in the first place. Notably, these patterns held regardless of gender, relationship status, or whether someone had actually experienced infidelity, meaning jealousy proneness is less about what has happened to you and more about underlying emotional wiring. There's also a neurological dimension. Brain imaging studies have found jealousy activates regions involved in reward processing, self-related thinking, and threat detection. Romantic jealousy involves both emotional and sexual components and occurs when a partner perceives a threat of loss to a rival, real or imagined, and in its most extreme form it can become delusional, fueling aggression, including domestic violence. Studies have also found jealousy is accompanied by increased activity in reward-related brain circuitry, and that greater jealousy correlates with a heightened tendency toward interpersonal aggression. This is sobering, but it's also clarifying. Jealousy isn't just an emotion that lives in your thoughts. It has a real physiological signature. That's part of why simply deciding to stop being jealous rarely works. You're not just arguing with a thought. You're trying to override a survival circuit. Part 3. The paradox at the heart of jealousy. Here's something genuinely fascinating that recent research has uncovered, and it explains why jealousy feels so confusing from the inside. A 2025 study published in the journal Emotion, led by researcher Myrna Jurich and colleagues, examined what jealousy actually does to the way we perceive our partner. The study explored how romantic jealousy, whether experienced directly or perceived in a partner, can lead to ambivalent, conflicted feelings within a relationship, finding that jealousy tends to trigger a blend of both positive and negative perceptions of one's partner at the same time. What did that look like in practice? When people felt jealous, they were more likely to simultaneously view their partner as highly attractive, a positive appraisal, while also viewing that same partner as less trustworthy. Similarly, people who believed their partner was jealous of them tended to perceive that partner as deeply committed, but also as mistrusting. The researchers describe this as a kind of emotional double-edged sword. On one side, jealousy can reaffirm a partner's value and encourage people to invest more in protecting the relationship, while on the other side it sparks mistrust and insecurity, pushing people to protect their own well-being instead. This is a crucial insight, because it explains why jealousy is so destabilizing. It is not a clean single emotion. It is two contradictory experiences happening at once. Heightened desire and heightened suspicion, pulling in opposite directions inside the same moment. That internal tug-of-war is exhausting, and over time, the suspicion side tends to win out, because suspicion demands action in a way that simple appreciation doesn't. There's a related insight from relationship researchers studying what's called the shadow of love, the idea, articulated by psychologist Ayala Pines, that the very qualities that drew you to your partner in the first place often become the precise focal point of your jealousy. One case Pines documented: a husband fell in love with his wife because she was beautiful, the kind of woman he'd only dared dream about as a shy teenager, and his jealousy ended up focusing on his own feelings of inferiority, eventually becoming so suffocating that after 20 years of marriage, she wanted a divorce. Pines argues this shows jealousy is, in a sense, the shadow of love itself. In other words, you are often jealous about exactly the qualities you fell in love with. The charisma that made them magnetic to you is the same charisma you now fear is magnetic to others. This is not a coincidence, it's a pattern. Part 4. How jealousy actually damages a marriage. So how does this emotion translate into real damage? It tends to happen along a few well-documented pathways. First, surveillance replaces conversation. Instead of saying, "I felt uneasy when you spent so long talking to him at the party," jealousy often expresses itself as checking phones, locations, social media. This is corrosive because surveillance is unilateral. It happens to your partner, not with them. And when it's eventually discovered, and it usually is, it tends to feel like a far deeper betrayal of trust than whatever the original suspicion was about. Second, accusation replaces curiosity. There's a real difference between, "Hey, who were you texting? I felt a little insecure," and "Who is he? Are you sleeping with him?" The first invites your partner in. The second puts them on trial. Third, jealousy creates the very distance it fears. A partner who is constantly questioned or monitored often begins to withdraw, not because they were doing anything wrong, but because being treated as a suspect is exhausting. That withdrawal is then read by the jealous partner as confirmation that something was wrong all along. The fear creates the behavior that appears to justify the fear. Researchers studying relational turbulence have documented this exact cycle, where jealousy and a partner's reaction to it reinforce one another and increase instability, independent of whether any actual betrayal occurred. Fourth, chronic jealousy keeps the nervous system in a constant state of threat. Living with frequent jealousy, whether you're the one feeling it or the one being suspected, is genuinely taxing on the body, not just the relationship. Marriages under chronic jealousy report lower relationship satisfaction and more conflict. And in extreme cases, this dynamic is linked to controlling behavior and, distressingly, has been associated with domestic violence in its most severe presentations. That's a reminder that jealousy exists on a spectrum, and at its extreme end, it stops being a private emotional struggle and becomes something that requires serious intervention. Fifth, jealousy can make a relationship feel valuable in the short term, while quietly poisoning it long term. This goes back to the ambivalence research. Jealousy can momentarily reaffirm how much your partner matters to you, almost like passion. But that short-term spike of "I don't want to lose this" does not build a stable marriage. It builds a marriage organized around fear of loss rather than security and connection. Those are two very different foundations to live on. Part 5. The Ancient Curiso. Here's the question this entire conversation has been building toward. If jealousy is this old, this wired in, this biologically stubborn, is there actually a way out? Or are we just supposed to live with it? This is where we turn to something genuinely ancient. A school of philosophy that was grappling with exactly this emotional problem over 2,000 years ago, and whose central insight has aged remarkably well. It's called Stoicism, and its core teaching on disruptive emotions like jealousy comes down to a single, deceptively simple idea known as the dichotomy of control. The idea was articulated most clearly by the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher in the 1st century. The dichotomy of control teaches that some things are within our power. Our thoughts, our choices, our actions, while many other things are not within our power at all, including other people's choices, opinions, and behavior. Epictetus argued that almost all human suffering comes from confusing these two categories, from treating things outside our control as though they were inside it, and then suffering when we inevitably fail to control them. Apply that lens to jealousy, and something becomes immediately clear. Your partner's inner thoughts, their attractions, their conversations, their choices about who to be friendly with. None of that has ever been within your control, and it never will be, no matter how much surveillance or interrogation you apply. What is within your control is something much narrower and, ultimately, much more powerful. Your own judgments, your own responses, your own character, and how you choose to show up in the relationship. This isn't a philosophy of passivity or pretending you don't have feelings. It's a redirection of energy away from an unwinnable battle, trying to control another person's mind, toward a winnable one. Managing your own reactions and communicating honestly about what you're experiencing. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and one of history's most famous Stoic writers, captured this same principle in his personal journal, Meditations. His core argument was that it's not the actions of others that disturb us, but our own judgment of those actions, meaning jealousy is treated as an irrational reaction to an external event, one that we hold the power to reshape from within our own minds. Notice what this does not say. It doesn't say your partner's behavior is irrelevant or that suspicion is never warranted. It says the intensity and direction of your emotional reaction is something you have far more authority over than you typically assume, because that reaction is built on an interpretation, a story you are telling yourself about what a piece of evidence means, and stories can be examined. The Stoics had a specific practical method for this, and it translates surprisingly well into a marriage. When a jealous thought arrives, "She's been quiet lately. Something must be wrong. She must be interested in someone else." The Stoic move is not to suppress the thought or act on it immediately. It's to interrogate it. Ask, "Is this something I actually know or something I am imagining?" And critically, "Is this something I can only resolve through worry and surveillance or only through honest conversation?" This single distinction between what you can control and what you cannot does something remarkably practical to jealousy. It takes the energy that would normally go into checking a phone for the fourth time and redirects it toward the one thing that has a real chance of resolving the underlying fear, speaking honestly with your partner, and examining why this particular fear has so much grip on you in the first place. There's a second piece of ancient wisdom worth pairing with this, also from the Stoic tradition, and it concerns self-worth. Stoic philosophy teaches that external validation matters far less than inner peace and self-belief, and that a person's value is not something others can diminish unless that person allows it. This matters enormously for jealousy because so much of marital jealousy is, underneath the surface, a referendum on self-worth. The fear isn't really, what if my partner talks to someone else? It's what if, given the choice, they'd prefer someone else to me. The Stoics would say, the antidote isn't extracting more reassurance from your partner. That well runs dry fast and never truly fills the gap. The antidote is building a sense of worth that doesn't depend on constant external proof. None of this means jealousy disappears overnight, and the Stoics never claimed it would. They were honest that mastering judgment is a lifelong practice, not a switch you flip. But here is what 2,000 years of philosophical practice and a growing body of modern psychological research agree on. The goal is not to eliminate the capacity to feel jealous. That capacity is part of being a creature that loves and attaches to another person. The goal is to stop letting that feeling dictate your actions before you've examined whether it's tracking something real. Part 6. Putting it into practice. Let's make this concrete. Because philosophy without practice is just a nice idea. Name it before you act on it. When the jealous spike hits, the single most powerful move is to create a pause between the feeling and the behavior. Say to yourself internally, "I am feeling jealous right now." Just naming it, rather than immediately checking a phone or firing off an accusation, interrupts the automatic loop and gives the rational part of your brain a chance to catch up. Apply the dichotomy directly. Ask yourself, what here is actually within my control? Usually the answer is my own behavior, my own words, whether I bring this up honestly or let it fester. What is outside my control? Usually, what my partner thinks, who they're friendly with. Spend your energy entirely on the first category. Replace surveillance with disclosure. Instead of investigating quietly, say the uncomfortable thing out loud. "I noticed I felt insecure when you mentioned him, and I want to understand why, because I don't think it's really about you." This is honest. And it shifts the work from detective work to self-reflection, which is where the real answer usually lives. Examine the story, not just the trigger. When jealousy spikes, there is almost always a specific narrative running underneath it. I'm not enough. People always leave. If I'm not vigilant, I'll be blindsided again. These stories often have roots that predate the marriage, sometimes reaching back to attachment patterns formed in childhood or past relationships where trust was actually broken. Identifying that story, ideally with a therapist if it runs deep, does more to reduce jealousy long-term than any amount of reassurance from a partner ever can. Build security that isn't outsourced. This is the modern echo of the Stoic point about self-worth. A marriage is healthiest when both partners feel secure largely from the inside and treat the relationship as a source of joy rather than the entire foundation holding up their sense of value. Practically, that might mean investing in friendships, work, and personal growth independent of the marriage, not as a hedge against the relationship, but because a person who feels whole on their own brings a calmer presence into partnership. Know the difference between a feeling and a fact. Feeling jealous does not mean you have detected real danger. Sometimes it does point to something real and worth addressing directly. Often it doesn't. The discipline is pausing long enough to tell the difference before acting as though the feeling itself is proof. And finally, Know when this needs more than self-help. If jealousy in a marriage is severe, frequent, involves controlling behavior, monitoring, restricting a partner's freedom, or any form of intimidation, that is no longer a matter of philosophical practice. It's a serious relational and safety issue, and it calls for professional support, ideally a licensed couples therapist, or individual support if the dynamics involve control or safety concerns. The tools we've discussed today are genuinely powerful for the everyday insecurity that shows up in even strong, healthy marriages. They are not a substitute for professional help when jealousy has crossed into something more dangerous. Jealousy is not a verdict on your character, and it's not a sign that your marriage is doomed. It's an old, deeply human response, one that evolution built into us, that our nervous systems amplify because of how much we need connection, and that philosophers have been studying and working to master for over 2,000 years. What separates a marriage that survives jealousy from one that's slowly eroded by it usually isn't the absence of the feeling. Almost everyone feels it at some point. What separates them is what happens in the gap between the feeling and the action, whether that gap is filled with surveillance and accusation, or with honest conversation and the harder, quieter work of examining your own fear. The Stoics left us a simple compass for navigating that gap. Control what's yours to control, your judgments, your words, your character, and release your grip on what was never yours to control in the first place, another person's heart. It's not a quick fix. It's a practice, but it's one that has helped people manage this exact emotion for over 2,000 years, and there's no reason it can't help you too.